Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so all this month, we have been talking about the connection between environmental racism and injustice and mental health. And so for this last episode of the month, we're going to discuss the impact that climate change has on your mental health. I'm not sure how often this is discussed or if we are even connecting the dots between the impacts of climate change and negative mental health outcomes that follow, but we need to make those connections. The connections between the impact like more frequent weather events and mental health issues, impacts like increasing temperature and negative mental health outcomes. So much of the mental anguish and stress experienced by so many people around the world is due to climate change. So let's talk about it on this episode. This is the last one for the month. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. So we are talking about the effects that climate change can have on people's mental health. And before we even get into all of that, let me just make sure that I'm very clear about where I stand on this issue. Human-induced climate change is a major global threat to our lives and our well-being. You heard me correctly. Human-induced climate change. The science is very clear about this. It is very evident that what we are doing to the planet is causing the climate to change in very negative ways. We are doing it. If you want to learn more about how bad it's gotten, I would recommend that you look at the most recent report done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is without question the most comprehensive report that's been done on the impacts of climate change and what needs to be done to deal with it. There's a link in the description. Click it, read it, learn more about it. It is a very serious issue. This is not a small, insignificant thing for a few people. Because of climate change, we're seeing extreme weather events occur with more intensity and with greater frequency. More droughts, more wildfires, more flooding, more heat waves. We're seeing these changing climate conditions result in increased food insecurity, particularly in the global south. And we're seeing more water insecurity all around the world. It's estimated that half of the world's population throughout the year experiences water insecurity because of climate change. We're seeing the destruction of entire ecosystems and habitats and biodiversity. We're seeing increasing malnutrition, famine, disease. The list just goes on and on and on. And it's all because of climate change. And these changes are caused by greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions, they trap heat from the sun, and as a result, the temperature increases, the climate changes around the world, and we as human beings are responsible for that. The way we consume fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, they emit greenhouse gases that contribute to the problem. From our power plants to our manufacturing plants, to our industries, to our transportation, we are consistently pumping more and more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, which is accelerating global warming around the world and the impacts of that warming, which we all call climate change. We are doing that. The way we manage our resources, our forests, our trees, we clear land for development. We clear land to do more farming, for pastures, for grazing. So many things that we do to our land contribute to climate change. We pave over areas where we cause more and more heat to be present in our environment. And when we clear out trees and forests and shrubs, we're removing the Earth's natural way of addressing the greenhouse gas emission problem because trees absorb carbon. They are able to reflect heat, and they do a lot to monitor and manage the temperature on Earth, and we're removing that by how we manage those resources. And so we are doing this, and we are responsible for all that we're seeing in the world. And let me just say another thing about that. Because when I say we, I don't mean every single person on earth equally is contributing, because that's just not true. When I say we, I'm talking about the wealthy nations, the wealthy individuals around the world. We are the ones who are contributing to this phenomenon called climate change. The United Nations says that the richest 1% of the world's population account for more greenhouse gas emissions than the bottom 50% of the global population. The International Monetary Fund says that the richest countries in the world are 16% of the population, but account for 40% of the carbon emissions. In the United States, we are 4% of the population around the world, but we contribute 25% of the world's emissions. So there's a big disparity. Poor countries contribute very little to the issue of climate change, but they are experiencing the greatest amount of impact from climate change. And we can talk all day about the physical and the environmental impacts, but I want to talk about the mental health impacts of climate change. That's what I want to discuss on this last day of Mental Health Awareness Month. So look, we need to talk more about mental health when we discuss environmental justice and its impact on vulnerable populations. We need to do it. Not only are there people who are experiencing disproportionate physical health impacts, but also mental health issues as well. And so when it comes to climate change and its impacts, at this point, the biggest, most prevalent, most researched mental health issue that goes with that is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. First, let me define it really quickly so we know what we're talking about. So PTSD is a psychiatric disorder that occurs in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event, a traumatic series of events, or who are dealing with a traumatic set of circumstances. And so when you have PTSD, you might experience intense, disturbing thoughts and feelings about your experiences or about that event. And those thoughts, those feelings will last long after the event is over, right? You might relive the event with flashbacks and nightmares. You might have overwhelming feelings of sadness, fear, and anger. You might feel detached or estranged from other people. You might even avoid situations that remind you of the trauma of the event that you experienced and went through. And so I know for me, when I hear PTSD, I automatically think war. I think about the veteran coming home from battle, off the battlefield, trying to make sense of a new world off the battlefield, dealing with PTSD. Or I'm thinking about the country where that war took place, and you have the bombing, and you have the shooting, and you have all the different elements of war that are experienced by people that live there. And so as a result of that wartime experience, those communities are also experiencing PTSD. I've read about that. I've heard about that. It's pretty common when people talk about PTSD as an issue. And there's also discussions about how other types of events can lead to people experiencing PTSD, right? Things like being through a terrorist attack, or if you're a victim of violence, if you've been attacked, if you've been assaulted, or if you've had your home broken into, or if you've experienced some kind of physical harm to yourself, you might be diagnosed with PTSD afterwards, depending on how your recovery goes. These are the ways that I've thought about and heard people discuss PTSD as a mental health issue. But now we know that natural disasters and people who go through them can find themselves diagnosed with PTSD. And so when you think about climate change, then you know that these natural disasters are happening more frequently and they're more intense. And so it's no wonder if you go through a natural disaster, you may experience PTSD from the destruction, from just the experience of going through it. It can be extremely traumatic. For instance, let's think about hurricanes for a second. So there's been tons of research about the instances of PTSD with people who have gone through hurricanes. So after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, a huge hurricane in Louisiana, 1 out of 6 people met the criteria for PTSD. After Hurricane Sandy in New York in 2012, 14.5% of the residents there had symptoms consistent with PTSD. Right? After Hurricane Harvey in Texas in 2017, 25% of those impacted met the criteria for PTSD. And after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, In 2017, PTSD rates were 44% for those on the island and 66% for those who left the island after the hurricane. And so we have lots of research and lots of data that show how prevalent PTSD can be when you're going through a hurricane. And notice how I talked about it. I said people who met the criteria for PTSD, people who have symptoms consistent with PTSD. And I said it that way because these studies are done by researchers, people who are trying to figure out what those mental health impacts are, and they're asking questions and doing their evaluations and trying to determine what's going on after these hurricanes move through. Because we don't have true mental health data from mental health professionals to tell us, because that is not part of the response to these hurricanes. So we have researchers trying to figure it out, but what we need are trained mental health professionals coming in and actually assessing, diagnosing, and treating the residents for PTSD and getting a better account of who's experiencing it and the degree to which they need help. We don't have that, and that's what's missing. And with this research now coming to light, with people being more and more aware, whenever there's a hurricane, we need to immediately think about some type of mental health intervention to help the people who are dealing with the fallout from that hurricane. And I say hurricane, it's not just hurricanes. Think about wildfires. Researchers are saying that wildfires increase the rates of PTSD for those who are affected by the wildfires and for the firefighters themselves trying to put out the wildfires. They also have to deal with PTSD as well. Flooding. Floods have been shown to increase rates of PTSD. So a study done in England in 2017 found that PTSD rates were between 25 and 40% for flood victims in that area. And so all of these natural disasters can result in PTSD being rampant in those communities that are affected by them. And so as climate change and its impacts increase, we'll see more of these kinds of events, and we'll see greater and greater numbers of people dealing with PTSD as a result. And it's not just PTSD, right? I mean, there's other mental health issues that come from dealing with a natural disaster. So for instance, after Hurricane Katrina, suicide doubled in those communities that were impacted. Depression, 49% of those communities in Hurricane Katrina dealt with depression. And there's other issues too. When you think about hurricanes, higher rates of substance use disorder, domestic violence, child abuse. All of these things have been shown to increase when you have families who are experiencing issues related to natural disasters. When they're going through a natural disaster, you will see these things more in these communities. And climate change is only making it worse. It's only getting worse as a result. More floods, more wildfires, more hurricanes. And we're entering into hurricane season now, and it seems like every year, hurricane season gets worse and worse. More hurricanes, more intense hurricanes. And so we can imagine that there will be more of these types of issues as a result of these natural disasters, which are brought about by climate change. We can't forget that. Climate change is the reason why we're seeing more and more of these kinds of issues. And natural disasters are just one impact of climate change. There are many, many others. I wish I had time to talk about them all. I don't. Let's just take one more. Let's just talk about heat for a second. So because of climate change, hot days are getting hotter and they're occurring more often. There's more heat waves and they're lasting longer and they're more frequent and they're more intense than they've ever been because of climate change. And this heat is a psychological stressor. It's an extreme source of stress. And now we know that increasing temperatures are linked to negative mental health outcomes, right? So increasing temperatures are linked to the following, according to the researchers: increased levels of suicide, increased numbers of mood and anxiety disorders, dementia, schizophrenia, decreased cognitive function, and more importantly, violence. So studies are showing a direct connection between increased levels of aggressive behavior and increasing temperatures. So for instance, A 2012 study done by the Harvard University Center for Business and Government calculated that between 2010 and 2099, climate change alone will cause an estimated, listen to this, it will cause an estimated 30,000 additional murders, 200,000 additional cases of rape, and 3.2 million additional burglaries because of increased temperatures. Now that's just scary to think that climate change could actually be responsible for an increase in crime across the world, an increase of violence from people just because it's getting hotter and hotter. And that's just the heat. I haven't talked about droughts where farmers are dealing with suicide at much higher rates because their livelihoods are tied into how the land produces, and the fact that there's no water and that the soil's not producing crops is damaging their livelihood, and they're taking their own lives as a result, who are in complete despair when they can't provide for themselves or their families. That's what climate change is doing. Or think about this. We now have what we're calling climate refugees. They're not fleeing violence. They're not fleeing war. They're fleeing because of the climate impacts that they're experiencing in their homes. The UN is estimating that 1.2 billion people, that's billion with a B, worldwide will be climate refugees by 2050. They're going to have to leave their homes and find a place to live because where they're from is uninhabitable. It's either too hot, there's drought, there's famine, or there's flooding, there's too many hurricanes, too much destruction to recover from, and they're going to have to flee their homes for safety because of these intense impacts of climate change. Think about all of the mental health issues associated with being displaced from your home, from seeing your community destroyed and you having to go somewhere else to live permanently. That is what's on the horizon as we think about what climate change is doing globally. Or what about the impact of mental health on the community, right? When the infrastructure is destroyed from a disaster, or when your relief doesn't come and you can't recover and rebuild, or when you're confronted with the reality that you can't actually withstand the impacts of climate change. You can't actually protect yourself from what's happening in your community because you don't have the resources. The leadership doesn't have the resolve to do what's necessary, and you have to leave. Your community is disintegrated. Everyone in that community suffers as a result of being unable to deal with those issues. So there are so many mental health impacts that come from dealing with the impacts of climate change that I can't fit them into one episode. There's just so many of them. It's so far reaching. It is so damaging. But let me just say this to end Mental Health Awareness Month. Climate change is a big problem. It is a big problem for us physically and mentally. Think about all the issues that can result from dealing with climate change. PTSD, depression, anxiety, suicide, violence, all because of the impacts of climate change. And the people who bear the brunt of these issues are not even primarily responsible for them. I mean, it just amazes me how big of a disparity there is between the people who contribute to the issues and the people who experience the fallout from them. It's so wild that the people who contribute the least to the problem of climate change experience the greatest impact from it. I mean, it just feels cruel. I mean, if you live in a wealthy country like I do, here in the United States of America, then you are much more responsible. I am much more responsible for climate change and its impacts than anyone else in the world. It's on us. And so, at the very least, we can advocate for vulnerable populations around the world to receive better mental health services. We can at least do that much. We might not be able to change policies, get governments to do the right thing. We can at least say, hey, get some mental health services to the people who are experiencing these impacts because they definitely need it. The research shows us that it's going to be a problem for them if they don't get it. The research is very clear. We need better mental health care for people dealing with climate change issues because climate change is not only damaging our bodies, but it is damaging our minds, and we need to address it soon. And that's our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.